The Galactic Conclave was not built in the orbit of any star because no star was trusted enough to host it. Instead, it hung in the dark between systems, a colossal ring of forged alloys and folded light, rotating slowly as if it were thinking. Inside its structure, entire civilizations met without ever touching the soil of another world. That was the promise of it. Neutrality, balance, equality. At least, that was what the records said. In truth, the Conclave Station had not belonged to everyone for a very long time. 12 species sat in the Chamber of 12, each with a voice, each with a vote, each with the official dignity of equals under interstellar law. Their platforms rose in a circular arrangement, layered like steps of authority. At the highest level sat the Thari Dominion, pale and still, their presence treated like gravity itself. Below them, the others arranged in descending order of political weight, influence, and military reach. And at the very bottom, almost touching the floor of the chamber, sat humanity. Not by accident. Not by engineering necessity. By design. Ambassador Sarah Voss had learned over the years that no one ever admitted the design part out loud. They would call it tradition, or spatial optimization, or ceremonial neutrality. But when you stood where she stood, looking up at 11 other species while speaking into a chamber that literally elevated them above you, the truth did not need words. Humanity was included, but not centered. Present, but not prioritized. Still, Earth had accepted its place. For 2 centuries, humanity had accepted it. They had joined the Conclave during the early expansion era, when faster-than-light travel first stabilized and species that had never imagined each other suddenly had to share trade lanes and border space. Humanity arrived later than most, without the oldest fleets or the largest empires, but with something that quickly became valuable: reliability. Humans fixed what broke. Humans mapped what others ignored. Humans negotiated what others destroyed. And because of that, they were useful. Useful enough to be kept. Ambassador Voss walked through the long corridor leading to the Chamber of 12. The walls were smooth, reflective, filled with faint streams of translated law updates and diplomatic notices scrolling in silent bands of light. Her footsteps were steady. Behind her followed 6 members of her diplomatic team, all human, all dressed in the deep blue formal uniform of Earth's interstellar service. None of them spoke. They did not need to. They had rehearsed this moment for weeks, but preparation did not change what it meant. Today was not a negotiation in the usual sense. Today was a request for recognition of something humanity had already done. The Outer Veil. A stretch of systems beyond the mapped jurisdiction of the Conclave. Dead stars, unstable gravity fields, resource-rich planets no one had bothered to catalog properly because the region was inconvenient, dangerous, and expensive to explore. Humanity had explored it anyway. Humanity had mapped it anyway. Humanity had made it usable. And now humanity was asking for sovereignty over what it had built value into. A simple request. A logical request. A fair request. At least, that was what Sarah Voss had believed when she first submitted it. The Chamber of 12 was already full when she entered. The Council was waiting, as always, as if time belonged to them more than it did to anyone else. The Thari Arbiter, High Arbiter Vitha, sat with her fingers folded, her yellow eyes half-lidded in patient observation. Sarah stepped onto the human platform at the bottom of the chamber. She did not look up immediately. She had learned that looking up first was part of the performance. Instead, she placed her hands on the podium and allowed the translation systems to connect. The room quieted in the way it always did when a human spoke first, not out of respect, but out of habit. She presented the request clearly. Outer Veil designation. Human-managed expansion rights. Recognition of surveyed systems and operational control over regions already stabilized by human infrastructure. No emotion. No exaggeration. Just fact. When she finished, silence held for exactly 3 seconds before the responses began. Predictable responses. The Thari spoke first. Controlled. Clinical. The Outer Veil, she said, was not a matter of ownership but of shared responsibility. It required review, oversight, long deliberation, multi-cycle evaluation, perhaps 2 or 3 standard years of council discussion. Other delegations murmured in agreement. Always the same pattern. Delay disguised as wisdom. Sarah had expected this part. What she had not expected was how effortless it would feel for them to dismiss something humanity had already spent decades building. She asked for a vote. That was when the tone changed. A formal vote was not common for procedural expansions. It forced clarity where ambiguity usually protected authority. The chamber shifted slightly, unwilling but compliant. Systems aligned. Protocols activated. The result was immediate. 10 against. 2 in favor. Humanity and 1 minor delegate from the Orath Collective. The rest did not even hesitate. Sarah Voss stood still at the podium as the result was announced. She looked up for the first time at the Chamber of 12. At the raised platforms. At the casual indifference of civilizations that did not need to fight for space anymore because they had already decided they owned it. High Arbiter Vitha was already speaking to her aides, as if the matter had already ceased to exist. That was when something inside Sarah stopped negotiating. She reached down and lifted the diplomatic seal of Earth from the podium. It was heavy, metallic, engraved with centuries of history that suddenly felt very small in that room. She placed it on the surface beside her. Not thrown. Not slammed. Just set down. A quiet finality. Then she spoke one sentence into the chamber, calm and perfectly translated into every listening system in the room. Then you will learn what you replaced. She turned and walked out. Behind her, 6 humans followed without hesitation. And for the first time in recorded conclave history, no one in the Chamber of 12 spoke as a human delegation left before the session was officially closed. The corridor outside the Chamber of 12 did not change after they left. It remained exactly the same, polished, quiet, filled with the same soft hum of translation relays and administrative systems that kept the conclave station functioning like a living organism. But for the humans walking through it, something fundamental had already shifted. Sarah Voss did not look back. Her team followed her in silence, their footsteps measured, controlled, almost rehearsed. No one asked her what she meant by the last sentence. They already knew the answer was not something you asked in a hallway. Behind them, the Chamber of 12 resumed its operations within minutes. The Council did what it always did when something uncomfortable happened. It minimized it. A statement was drafted. Humanity's withdrawal was regrettable. Procedural. Manageable. The conclave would continue as normal. High Arbiter Vitha approved it without hesitation. And for a brief moment, the galaxy believed that nothing important had changed. That illusion lasted less than 3 hours. In orbit above the conclave station, human vessels began to shift position. At first, it looked routine. Cargo transfers. Maintenance rotations. Diplomatic shuttles returning to fleet carriers. The kind of movement that happened every day across Council space and never meant anything beyond logistics. But then more ships moved. Not just one sector. Not just one fleet. All of them. Human engineering vessels detached from shared conclave infrastructure systems. Medical ships that had served alien populations for decades began powering down external contracts. Navigation craft that had maintained Rift corridor guidance systems quietly severed their interface connections and recalibrated their own routes. Nothing dramatic. No alarms. No declarations. Just withdrawal. One system at a time, human presence began to vanish from Council operations. On the conclave station itself, it started with the engineering layers. Human technicians were the backbone of several station stabilization systems. They were the ones who understood the older conclave architecture, the hybrid systems built during early integration, the components that no other species had ever fully bothered to learn because humans had always been there to maintain them. They packed their tools without argument, logged out of systems, handed over access keys that no one else knew how to fully use, and left. When asked for instructions, they gave none. Because there were none. At the medical wing, human doctors completed their final shifts without announcement. Patients from multiple species were stabilized, transferred, or discharged according to protocol. Then, at shift end, the human staff removed their identification tags, placed them in disposal bins, and walked out. No speeches. No confrontation. Just absence. The first confusion did not come from humans leaving. It came from the realization that no replacement existed. On paper, the conclave had redundancy protocols. Every critical system was supposed to have multi-species oversight, shared knowledge, distributed control. In practice, humans had become the silent bridge between systems that did not naturally communicate with each other. They translated more than language. They translated functionality. And no one had ever bothered to replace that role. By the end of the first cycle, the station began to feel subtly wrong. Not broken. Not yet. Just less responsive. A navigation correction took longer than expected. A trade routing update lagged by several seconds. A minor calibration error in a docking bay remained unresolved because the human engineer who would normally fix it had already departed, and the automated system did not understand the underlying architecture well enough to intervene. On the council floor, High Arbiter Vitha received the first report. She read it carefully. Then she dismissed it as transitional inefficiency. Human withdrawal, she stated publicly, would cause temporary disruption but no long-term impact. Other delegations agreed. They had always believed that humans were replaceable. The mistake was not malicious. It was habitual. Humanity had never demanded recognition proportional to its contribution. They had accepted lower platforms, slower votes, delayed approvals, conditional access. In return, they had ensured the system kept working. So the Council assumed the system would continue working without them. That assumption lasted until the second cycle. That was when the Rift Corridor network began to fail. The Rift Corridors were the backbone of conclave commerce. Faster-than-light transit lanes stabilized by continuous calibration fields. Without them, interstellar travel reverted to slow, inefficient drift routes that made coordinated civilization functionally impossible at scale. Human engineers had designed most of the stabilization logic. Human teams had maintained it for over a century. And human oversight had quietly compensated for every species' inability to fully understand the system's layered complexity. When the first corridor flickered unstable, the warning was mild. When the second began to drift out of alignment, concern appeared. When the third collapsed entirely for 17 seconds before auto-stabilizing in a degraded state, panic entered the system for the first time. Emergency engineering teams were dispatched. They arrived with confidence. They returned with uncertainty. The manuals were incomplete. The system architecture was partially human proprietary. Translation layers failed to properly convert key diagnostic fields. And the deeper issue became obvious only after repeated failure. No one fully understood what humans had been maintaining. On the conclave station, council members began asking for human assistance. The requests were polite at first, then urgent, then increasingly confused. Human response channels remained open, but replies were minimal. Short acknowledgments. No commitments. No solutions. No return schedules. Inside Fleet Command channels, Admiral Jonas Reth received the first consolidated report of corridor instability while aboard the human carrier Times Endurance. He read it without expression. Then he closed the display. Sarah Voss stood beside him in the observation deck, watching the movement of ships outside the viewport. Human vessels were still leaving Council space in structured formation, like a tide pulling away from a shore that suddenly realized it had depended on the water more than it understood. Reth finally spoke. "They think this is inconvenience." Sarah did not look away from the stars. "It isn't," she said. Behind them, a maintenance crew sealed another docking connection. Quietly. Permanently. And somewhere far behind, in the Chamber of 12, the first real doubt began to form inside the conclave that what they had dismissed as human presence might actually have been the thing holding everything together. The first collapse was not dramatic. It never is. It began in the places no one ever looks at when everything is working properly. A trade route between two mid-tier systems went dark for 47 seconds before stabilizing in a degraded state. A cargo convoy arrived 6 hours late and 3 navigation logs were corrupted beyond recovery. A station in the outer commercial band reported a docking misalignment that automated systems could not correct without manual override. And in each case, the same answer came back from every human-operated support channel. No intervention available. The conclave did not panic yet. It rationalized. Systems fail. That was normal. Systems recover. That was expected. Redundancy existed. Backup protocols existed. Multiple species contributed to infrastructure oversight. The absence of one participant, even a significant one, should not destabilize the whole. That was the official logic. But logic does not repair a rift corridor. And logic does not stabilize a navigation lattice designed by engineers who are no longer present. On the 9th cycle after humanity's departure from conclave operational systems, the first major failure occurred. A rift corridor between two major trade hubs collapsed entirely. Not partially. Not degraded. Collapsed. For 38 minutes, a stretch of space that had been stable for decades simply stopped being traversable. Ships attempting entry were forcibly ejected at random coordinates. 3 cargo vessels emerged in uncontrolled drift paths and required emergency recovery. One nearly collided with a mining platform before manual thruster override saved it at the last moment. That was when the tone changed. Not in public statements. In private communications. Council engineers began sending messages that contained a word that had never been common in conclave infrastructure reports. Uncertain. High Arbiter Vitha convened an emergency session. It was the first time in years that the Chamber of 12 did not feel like a controlled environment. Delegates spoke over each other. Accusations formed faster than conclusions. The Thari insisted the systems were stable when properly maintained. The KTH representatives demanded accountability for trade disruption. The Tauric delegation suggested sabotage was statistically improbable but politically convenient to investigate. And the Orith representatives said nothing at all, simply observing with still compound eyes, tracking every argument like a calculation that had already reached its result. The Arbiter demanded clarity. She did not receive it. Because clarity required understanding the systems. And understanding required the people who had built them. Meanwhile, across council space, human presence continued to recede. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Systematically. Engineering hubs where humans had once worked were now staffed exclusively by non-human technicians attempting to interpret incomplete system frameworks. Medical facilities adapted slowly, with mixed success. Navigation assistance nodes attempted to compensate for missing human routing logic and introduced new errors in the process. Every attempt to replace human function created more instability than it solved. And still, no one admitted dependency. Because admitting dependency meant admitting a deeper truth. That humanity had not been just another participant in the conclave. They had been structural. At the edge of the outer veil, Admiral Jonas Reth received a classified transmission. It contained 3 lines. Rift corridor failure rate increasing. Trade delays exceeding projected tolerances. Multiple species requesting emergency human reinstatement. Reth forwarded it to Sarah Voss without comment. Sarah read it once. Then she set it down. "They're starting to understand," Reth said. Sarah finally turned from the viewport. "No," she replied quietly. "They're starting to notice." There was a difference. A significant one. Understanding implied acceptance. Noticing only meant discomfort. And discomfort was not enough to change behavior in systems as large as the Conclave. Back on the station, High Arbiter Vitha addressed the Council publicly. Her voice remained composed. Controlled. Authoritative. She acknowledged temporary logistical disruptions. She stated that contingency systems were being deployed. She assured member species that order would be restored. But the way she said it had changed. There was less certainty, more emphasis, more repetition of stability, and beneath it, something quieter. Concern. Because reports were no longer isolated. They were systemic. Rift corridors were failing faster than engineers could stabilize them. Trade networks were fragmenting into regional clusters. Military coordination exercises were producing inconsistent results due to navigational lag. And worst of all, no species could agree on why. Because every explanation led back to the same missing variable. Human maintenance. Human design oversight. Human translation between incompatible systems. Human presence in places that had never been officially acknowledged as essential. In the private chambers of the Thari Dominion, High Arbiter Vitha reviewed the original vote record. 10 against. 2 in favor. One of those 2 had been human. The other had been Orith. She paused on that detail longer than she expected. Then she dismissed the file. Not because it was unimportant, but because it was uncomfortable. And discomfort, left unresolved, becomes something else entirely when stretched across collapsing systems. Outside the conclave station, another rift corridor flickered. This time, it did not recover cleanly. It stabilized in a degraded configuration that reduced throughput capacity by 47%. For the first time in 2 centuries, the conclave did not expand. It contracted. The first war after humanity's departure did not begin with a declaration. It began with a misunderstanding that no longer had human mediators to dissolve it. The disputed cluster between the Usolari and the Tauric had always been unstable, but stability in that region had never come from agreement. It had come from management. Carefully timed negotiations. Human-led arbitration. Pressure applied at precise moments when both sides were still close enough to compromise but far enough from victory to avoid escalation. That system had worked for 30 years. Because humans had been there to hold it together. Now they were not. The Usolari moved first. Not because they were more aggressive, but because they were faster to interpret absence as opportunity. A fleet entered the outer edge of the disputed cluster and established positions on 2 resource-rich systems. Their claim was immediate, formal, and broadcast across all conclave channels. The Tauric response followed within days. Then silence ended. Then firing began. The first engagement lasted 6 hours. 240 lives were lost across both sides before either command structure fully realized that escalation protocols no longer had a neutral party to pause them. By the second engagement, restraint had already collapsed. Not from hatred. From momentum. On Conclave Station, emergency council sessions multiplied. No one agreed on jurisdiction. No one agreed on intervention authority. No one agreed on whether intervention was even possible without triggering broader instability in already failing systems. And beneath every argument sat the same unspoken truth. There were no humans left to stabilize the transition. High Arbiter Vitha authorized a limited peacekeeping deployment. It was assembled quickly, inconsistently, and under severe political pressure. Ships were drawn from multiple member species, each using different command architectures, different translation layers, and different tactical doctrines that had never been fully integrated without human systems acting as the connective layer. The fleet launched anyway. It arrived late. That was the first failure. Its internal command structure fractured within hours of entering the conflict zone. That was the second. Orders contradicted each other across species lines. Translation delays caused timing mismatches between coordinated maneuvers. Tactical interpretations diverged so widely that 2 sections of the same fleet nearly engaged each other before realizing the error. The peacekeeping force issued demands for ceasefire. Neither side acknowledged them. The Usolari and Tauric were now fighting a war that no longer had a referee. And wars without referees do not slow down. They accelerate. Meanwhile, across the wider conclave, instability was no longer confined to infrastructure. It was becoming political. Member species began withdrawing trust from central authority structures. Trade unions reported independent routing strategies. Border patrols stopped waiting for council authorization before responding to perceived threats. And everywhere, the same question began to surface in different forms. What happens if this continues? On the conclave station, High Arbiter Vitha stood before the council and attempted to restore order through language. She spoke of unity, of shared responsibility, of the need to remain calm during transitional disruption. But her words no longer carried the same weight. Because calm required confidence. And confidence required functioning systems. And functioning systems required the very presence that had recently been removed. In the corridors outside the chamber, delegates argued openly for the first time in decades. The KTH representatives accused the arbiter of mismanagement. The Tauric delegation, even while engaged in war, demanded council restructuring. The Usolari envoys refused mediation offers outright, stating they would not pause territorial expansion for a system that could not even maintain its own infrastructure. And the Orith delegate simply watched. Always watched. As if confirming something that had been understood long before anyone else was willing to admit it. Far beyond the station, on the edge of conclave space, fringe civilizations began to move. At first, cautiously. A scouting vessel crossed into an unmonitored system. No human patrol responded. No coordinated deterrence followed. The vessel returned unharmed. Then another followed. Then more. Each probe confirmed the same reality. Human border enforcement was gone. And what remained of conclave enforcement was slow, fragmented, and uncertain. Admiral Jonas Reth received the intelligence reports aboard the carrier Times Endurance. He did not react immediately. He read each line carefully. Then he closed the terminal. "They're testing us," he said. Sarah Voss stood beside him. "No," she replied. Reth looked at her. "They're learning what's no longer there." She corrected him. There was a difference. And that difference was becoming visible across the entire structure of the conclave. In orbit, another rift corridor failed to stabilize properly after automated repair attempts. For the first time, the failure was not temporary. It remained unstable. And somewhere deep within the conclave's administrative core, systems that had always assumed human oversight began to generate error states they could not classify. Not because they were damaged, but because they were incomplete. The decision to assemble the Armada was not made in a single room. It was assembled through fear spread across many rooms, each one convincing itself it was acting rationally. High Arbiter Vitha called it stabilization enforcement. The Tauric called it necessary containment. The KTH called it economic protection. The Usulari called it preemptive correction. But beneath all the names, the structure was the same. A response to something they no longer understood. The official justification was simple. Humanity had withdrawn from conclave obligations, destabilized core infrastructure through abandonment, and established an independent zone in the outer veil without authorization. Therefore, they were a rogue element. Therefore, they had to be brought back under council law, or removed from influencing council systems. The vote passed. 7-5. Barely enough to move forward. But enough. Within 10 days, ships began assembling. Not small patrol groups. Not diplomatic escorts. A full military formation drawn from 9 species, coordinated under a unified command structure that had never been tested at this scale without human logistical integration. 340 warships. The largest conclave military formation in 3 centuries. On paper, it was overwhelming force. In practice, it was fragile coordination held together by assumption. High Arbiter Vitha addressed the Council publicly before deployment. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness felt practiced rather than natural. She spoke of restoring order, of correcting instability, of ensuring that no civilization could operate outside collective responsibility. She did not say humanity specifically was dangerous. But she did not need to. Everyone understood the target. Across neutral space, observer vessels recorded everything. One of them belonged to a KTH observer captain named Darovel. He watched the Armada form from a distance and made a private note. Large forces without unified doctrine rarely behave as intended. He did not send that note publicly. Not yet. Because in the conclave, caution had become politically inconvenient. The Armada moved slowly at first, then faster as coordination protocols stabilized. It broadcast its approach deliberately. This was not stealth. It was pressure. A message in motion. At the edge of the outer veil, Admiral Jonas Reth waited. 90 human ships held position in a fractured debris corridor known as the Shatter Margin. They were not scattered. They were positioned, layered, controlled. Each vessel held a role in a system designed for engagement, disruption, and withdrawal if necessary. No unnecessary movement. No wasted signal. No emotional escalation. Just readiness. Reth stood on the bridge of the flagship Times Endurance and watched the approaching Armada on tactical displays. 340 signatures. Slow. Confident. Uncoordinated at the edges. He exhaled once. Not in fear. In confirmation. Sarah Voss stood behind him. "They're still treating this like a vote they can enforce," she said. Reth replied quietly, "They've never lost a vote before." The Armada crossed into the Shatter Margin. And immediately, everything changed. Human systems activated. Not in response to panic. In response to entry. Electronic warfare arrays engaged across all human vessels simultaneously. The effect was immediate and total. Conclave communication networks fractured. Fleet-wide coordination channels collapsed into isolated local clusters. Species-specific encryption systems failed under layered interference designed over decades of studying exactly how each civilization structured its signals. The Armada did not lose ships first. It lost unity. And without unity, it was no longer an armada. It was 340 independent warships in the same region of space. Confusion spread faster than firepower. Orders arrived late or not at all. Some ships attempted coordination through backup systems that were already being selectively jammed. Others broke formation instinctively, trying to regain visual clarity in a space that no longer supported collective control. Then the human ships moved. They did not rush forward. They did not charge. They split. Small coordinated groups of 4 or 5 vessels moved through gaps in the fragmented formation with precision that looked almost effortless. Targets were selected before engagement. Systems were disabled rather than destroyed. Weapons arrays went offline. Engines failed. Navigation systems locked into drift states. But life support remained intact. Always intact. On the Thari flagship, alarms filled the bridge. The fleet commander shouted orders into channels that returned nothing but fragmented static. Across his display, ships were disappearing from effective control one by one, not destroyed, but rendered inert. A controlled removal of capability. Not violence without restraint, but restraint as strategy. Captain Darrow Vell, watching from his observer vessel far behind the engagement zone, recorded the pattern carefully. Then he spoke for the first time in hours. "They're not fighting to win quickly," he said. His first officer looked at him. "What are they doing?" Vell paused. "Making sure we understand the difference between defeat and destruction." By the 4th hour, the Armada was broken as a unified force. Over 200 ships had been disabled or forced into retreat vectors. Not a single confirmed fatality. Not one. Every damaged vessel retained life support. Every crew survived. On the human flagship, Reth monitored the final engagement phases without urgency. Then he opened a channel to the remaining intact command core of the Armada. The Thari commander appeared on screen. For the first time, he did not look composed. Reth spoke calmly. "You brought 340 ships into our territory." He paused. 90 ships stopped you." Another pause. "And not a single one of your crews is dead." Silence followed. Reth leaned slightly forward. "We didn't kill your ships," he said. "We could have." A longer silence. "Go home," he continued, "and explain the difference." Then he closed the channel. In the debris field, disabled ships drifted in silence. Not destroyed. Not erased. Just stopped. And across every surviving communication channel still functioning outside the jamming field, the same recording began to spread. Not as propaganda. As evidence. The Armada did not retreat with dignity. It retreated with silence. What remained of its formation fractured in layers, each species pulling back through degraded command channels, trying to re-establish control over ships that no longer responded as a unified force. There was no pursuit. The human fleet did not follow. It did not need to. 90 ships had not defeated 340 by chasing them. They had done it by demonstrating control. And control, once understood, cannot be unseen. In the hours after the engagement, the shatter margin became a graveyard of drifting warships. Not destroyed vessels. Disabled ones. Engines offline. Weapons locked. Communication arrays still functional, broadcasting fragmented distress signals across a conclave network that no longer responded as it once did. Every crew was alive. That fact spread faster than the defeat itself, because it forced a new kind of realization. This was not rage. It was precision. On the flagship Times Endurance, Admiral Jonas Reth stood in silence as recovery teams began marking disabled vessels for retrieval corridors. Sarah Voss reviewed casualty reports that contained the same line repeated hundreds of times. No fatalities confirmed. She closed the file. That was intentional, she said. Reth nodded once. Yes. There was no satisfaction in his expression. Only weight. Because restraint at that scale was not simple mercy. It was discipline under pressure. And discipline like that sent a message even louder than destruction. Across conclave space, the first reactions were not political. They were psychological. Species that had contributed ships to the Armada began releasing statements that avoided direct reference to the engagement itself. Words like miscalculation and unexpected resistance replaced the word defeat. The KTH Merchant Union was the first to break that pattern. Their senior representative appeared before a public council feed and spoke bluntly. "We sent 340 ships," he said. "And we achieved nothing." Then he paused. "That is not a military failure." Another pause. "That is a structural one." That word spread quickly. Structural. Because it implied something deeper than tactics. It implied dependency. On Conclave Station, High Arbiter Vitha convened an emergency recovery session. The chamber felt different now. Not physically. Politically. Delegates were no longer arguing about intervention. They were arguing about interpretation. Was humanity dangerous? Was humanity defensive? Was humanity even still operating under conclave-defined logic? No one agreed. Because no one had a framework that accounted for what had just happened. The Orith delegate remained silent throughout. As always. But observers noted that it had not shown surprise. Only confirmation. Meanwhile, in the outer veil, human operations continued without interruption. Bastion Velar, the massive station under construction above the primary terraforming zone, had not slowed during the conflict. If anything, it had accelerated. Ships moved in coordinated cycles between construction layers, supply routes, and defense perimeters with an efficiency that no conclave observer network could replicate. There was no panic. No celebration. Just continuation. On the observation deck, Commander Asha Kemdarim reviewed incoming construction logs while speaking with engineers from 3 different species over integrated translation systems. Orith structural specialists worked alongside human fabrication crews. Delhari navigators adjusted orbital positioning calculations in real time. Messon communication analysts optimized deep space relay stability. The system functioned because every participant understood one rule. Nothing here depended on assumption. Everything was verified. Admiral Reth arrived later that cycle. He stood beside Sarah Voss as they observed the station expanding through open space like a living lattice of steel and light. Sarah spoke first. "They'll rebuild their fleet," she said. Reth replied, "Yes." A pause. "And they'll try again," she added. Another pause. "Yes," he said again. Sarah finally turned to him. "Will it matter?" Reth did not answer immediately. He watched a convoy of Orith-engineered transport vessels align with a human docking array without hesitation, without miscommunication, without delay. Then he said quietly, "Not in the way they think it will." Behind them, data streams updated in real time. The Outer Veil Compact had entered its second phase of expansion. 3 additional species had initiated contact protocols. 2 more had requested observation rights. And across conclave space, something more subtle was happening. Ships that had participated in the Armada were returning home. But their crews were not returning unchanged. Reports filtered in from multiple systems describing identical behavioral patterns. Command uncertainty. Increased caution. Reduced willingness to engage in coordinated enforcement actions without absolute clarity. Because the engagement had revealed something that could not be unlearned. Human ships did not win by being larger. They did not win by being louder. They won by controlling systems others did not realize were vulnerable. And they did it without killing. That combination mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. On Conclave Station, a sealed internal report circulated among senior administrators. It contained a single-line summary of the engagement. Humanity possesses complete dominance over conclave communication and coordination infrastructure in contested zones. Below it, another line was added by an analyst who did not sign their name. They did not escalate violence. They escalated control. High Arbiter Vitha read the report alone. For a long time, She did not move. Then she closed it. Outside her chamber, the council continued debating terminology. But inside, something had already shifted. Because now, for the first time in centuries, the conclave was no longer certain it understood the species it had voted against. The collapse of authority did not happen in a single moment. It happened in layers. First, trust. Then coordination. Then certainty. After the Armada incident, conclave space did not become peaceful. It became uncertain in a way that was far more dangerous than open conflict. Every major system began to reevaluate its assumptions. Trade routes that had once been considered safe were now rerouted with redundancy layers. Military patrols that had once moved with confidence now required multiple confirmation protocols before engagement. Even diplomatic communication slowed, as if every message needed to pass through additional filters of doubt. Because one fact had become impossible to ignore. Humanity had not escalated the system. They had simply demonstrated what was already inside it. On paper, nothing had changed. The conclave still existed. The Chamber of 12 still met. High Arbiter Vitha still issued directives. But in practice, authority had fractured into interpretation. And interpretation does not scale. Across the Rift Corridor network, instability increased. Not because systems were being actively sabotaged, but because maintenance cycles were incomplete. Human engineers had once provided silent correction for variables that other species never fully accounted for. Small deviations in energy harmonics. Timing drift in stabilization pulses. Cross-species translation lag in control commands that seemed negligible until accumulated across thousands of nodes. Now those corrections were gone. And the system was revealing itself in its raw form. 3 major corridors failed within a single cycle. Not catastrophically, but operationally. They entered degraded states that reduced throughput capacity by nearly half. Trade convoys began to stack in holding zones. Delays became systemic. Prices began to fluctuate across multiple economic sectors simultaneously. For the first time in conclave history, the KTH Merchant Union reported synchronized loss patterns across all major trade routes. That report changed everything. Because the KTH did not tolerate instability in commerce. On Conclave Station, emergency economic summits were convened. The KTH representative stood before the chamber and spoke with unusual directness. "We are no longer dealing with a military anomaly," he said. "We are dealing with systemic dependency failure." The room did not interrupt him. That silence was new. It meant attention had replaced assumption. Elsewhere, border systems began to fail in smaller but more dangerous ways. Fringe civilizations tested boundaries more aggressively than before. Not because they were hostile, but because the absence of human patrol response had removed the psychological constraint that had quietly maintained order for decades. A single reconnaissance probe entered a lightly defended conclave mining system and returned without resistance. Within weeks, similar probes increased in frequency. The pattern was clear. Pressure increases where resistance is uncertain. And resistance had become uncertain. On the flagship Times Endurance, Admiral Jonas Reth reviewed intelligence reports showing escalating edge zone incursions. He did not appear surprised. Sarah Voss read the same reports beside him. "They're probing the structure," she said. Reth nodded. "They always were. But now they can't see where the pressure points are enforced," she continued. "Because we're not there to show them," he replied. A pause. That was the deeper implication. Human presence had not just enforced borders. It had defined them. Without that definition, everything became negotiable again. And in interstellar politics, negotiable often becomes contested. Meanwhile, internal fractures within the conclave deepened. The Usolari-Tauric conflict, once localized, began to spread indirectly through allied systems. Trade disruption led to resource shortages. Resource shortages led to political instability. Political instability led to opportunistic border expansions in adjacent regions. Each crisis fed another. And the conclave, for all its sophistication, lacked one essential component. A unified corrective mechanism that could operate without human integration. High Arbiter Vitha attempted to restore cohesion through legal restructuring. New directives were issued. Emergency protocols activated. Cross-species coordination committees expanded. But every solution introduced complexity faster than it resolved it. Because complexity had always been managed by humans in the background. Quietly. Without recognition. At Bastion Velar, the situation was different. Expansion continued. Not unchecked, but controlled. 3 new species had joined operational agreements within a short cycle. Each integration required precise calibration of roles, responsibilities, and system interfaces. And each time, human engineers and allied species worked together to ensure nothing was assumed that could be verified. The Orith proved particularly effective in structural design integration. Their mathematical modeling systems complemented human adaptive engineering in ways that significantly reduced construction errors. Delhari navigators stabilized route mapping across unstable regions with near-perfect accuracy. Meson communication networks eliminated latency mismatches that had plagued conclave systems for centuries. It was not expansion in the traditional sense. It was reconstruction. Admiral Reth referred to it once as building what they didn't know they were missing. Sarah did not correct him, because he was not wrong. But even here, beyond the reach of conclave instability, the consequences of earlier actions were beginning to echo. Intelligence reports indicated that High Arbiter Vitha had begun consolidating political support among remaining loyalist factions. Not for reconciliation, but for reassertion. A classified motion was circulating within the reduced council structure. It redefined humanity's withdrawal not as secession, but as destabilizing defection. And it proposed corrective action. Not immediately, but inevitably. When resources allowed. When stability returned. When strength was sufficient again. Reth read the report in silence. Then he closed it. "They're preparing for round 2, he said. Sarah Voss stood at the viewport, watching ships move between Bastion Velar's growing frameworks. "Yes," she said. A pause. "But they're still thinking in the old structure." Reth looked at her. "And we're not." Outside, another rift corridor flickered into unstable alignment. This time, there was no emergency stabilization window. It simply degraded into reduced capacity and remained that way. And somewhere deep in conclave core systems, a pattern recognition model flagged a growing anomaly it could not classify. Not a failure. Not a sabotage. Just absence of correction. And absence, once large enough, becomes indistinguishable from collapse. At first, the conclave did what collapsing systems always do when they refuse to accept collapse. It denied. The official statements remained calm. Measured. Carefully worded in the language of stability. Temporary disruption. Localized inefficiencies. Expected transitional instability following human withdrawal. But behind those words, something else was happening. Fear was changing shape. It was no longer fear of humanity as a political actor. It was fear of dependency being exposed. On Conclave Station, High Arbiter Vitha convened another emergency council session. The chamber was smaller now. Not physically. Politically. Fewer delegations carried the same confidence they once had. Fewer voices spoke without hesitation. Even the platforms seemed quieter, as if the station itself was listening more carefully than before. The first reports were presented without emphasis. Rift corridor throughput down across multiple sectors. Trade synchronization delays increasing beyond acceptable margins. Automated repair systems failing to resolve cascading instability. Navigation confidence intervals degrading in edge regions. No single report was catastrophic. Together, they were undeniable. The KTH representative was the first to speak. "This is not disruption," he said. "This is structural degradation." The word again. Structural. It had become unavoidable. Because it implied something the Council did not want to face. That the system had not been temporarily supported by humanity. It had been permanently dependent on them. Elsewhere in Council space, localized conflicts intensified. The Usolari-Toric War expanded into neighboring systems due to uncontrolled resource pressure. Without stable rift corridor logistics, reinforcements arrived late, fragmented, or not at all. Peacekeeping attempts failed not because they were opposed. but because they were incoherent. Orders issued from Central Command were interpreted differently by each species' command structure. Translation systems introduced delays that turned synchronized action into staggered response. In warfare, timing is everything. And timing had been one of the things humans had quietly managed across the entire network. Now it was gone. On the Conclave station, delegates began to argue openly about responsibility. Some blamed High Arbiter Vitha directly. Others blamed the vote that had expelled humanity. Others blamed humanity itself, insisting that withdrawal had been reckless and punitive. But none of these arguments addressed the underlying truth. No one had asked what would happen if the maintenance layer disappeared, because no one had believed there was a maintenance layer. In their minds, humanity had been a participant, not a foundation. That illusion was now breaking under accumulated pressure. At the edge of conclave space, fringe civilizations continued their cautious expansion into formerly restricted zones. They did not encounter resistance in the form they expected. Instead, they encountered hesitation. Uncoordinated patrols, delayed responses, conflicting authority signals. The deterrent structure that had once kept them at the edge of conclave influence was no longer functioning as a unified system. So they advanced further. Not aggressively, curiously, testing. Each test revealed the same pattern. The system no longer reacted as a single entity. It reacted as fragments. And fragments do not deter. Fragments invite pressure. In the outer veil, Bastion Velar continued to expand. But now expansion carried a different weight. Not just growth. Responsibility. Because the instability within conclave space was no longer distant. It was beginning to spill into neutral zones. Trade partners requesting integration support arrived faster than expected. Species that had once remained outside conclave politics were now actively seeking stable alternatives. The Orith representative, Venri, reviewed incoming requests alongside Sarah Voss in a coordination chamber aboard Bastion Velar. The volume is increasing, Venri observed. It will continue to increase, Sarah replied, because instability spreads faster than order. Venri tilted its head slightly. Then order must move faster than instability. Sarah allowed a faint pause. That is the challenge, she said. On the other side of the station, Admiral Jonas Reth reviewed a classified intelligence stream. High Arbiter Vitha had initiated internal consolidation protocols. Political factions loyal to her were being reorganized into a tighter command structure. The language used in these internal communications had changed. It no longer focused on stability. It focused on correction. Correction of anomaly. Correction of destabilization. Correction of defection. Reth did not need to be told what that implied. He forwarded the intelligence to Sarah. She read it once. Then again. They're reframing it, she said quietly. Reth nodded. As preparation. For what? She asked. He did not answer immediately. Because the answer was obvious, even if unspoken. Confrontation always becomes inevitable when explanation fails. On Conclave Station, High Arbiter Vitha addressed a closed council assembly. Her tone was no longer purely administrative. It carried something sharper. Resolve under pressure. We are facing a coordinated destabilization event, she said. This is not natural system failure. This is the consequence of an unregulated secession. Several delegates shifted uneasily. The KTH representative frowned. The Orith delegate remained still. Vitha continued. We will restore order. But the word restore no longer meant what it once did. It no longer implied repair. It implied reversal. And reversal, in this context, meant confrontation. Outside the chamber, corridor lights flickered again as another rift corridor degraded into unstable throughput. For a brief moment, the entire station experienced a subtle vibration as synchronization systems struggled to compensate for missing calibration inputs. Then it stabilized. But not fully. Not anymore. And somewhere in that instability, the conclave crossed an invisible threshold. From managing consequences to preparing for conflict with the cause. The motion did not begin with war. It began with language designed to make war inevitable. High Arbiter Vitha did not call it an attack. She called it a corrective expedition, a restoration of lawful order, a containment response to destabilizing secession. But everyone in the conclave understood what it meant, even if they refused to say it directly. Humanity was to be brought back under control, or removed as a destabilizing presence. The vote passed in a chamber that felt less like a governing body and more like a system trying to convince itself it was still functional. 7 in favor, 5 against. No abstentions this time, because abstention no longer felt safe. The conclave armada was assembled again. But this time, it was not a reaction. It was a declaration. Ships were pulled from remaining loyalist fleets across 9 species. The KTH refused outright, calling it economically suicidal. The Orath formally withdrew all participation, stating only that they would not engage in actions against a species that had demonstrated restraint under provocation. That statement caused more internal unrest than any battlefield report. Because restraint was not supposed to matter. Power was. At least, that was the old belief. 340 warships were gathered again, though the composition was weaker, more fragmented, less confident. The commanders tried to compensate with coordination drills. But coordination drills cannot replace missing structural intelligence. High Arbiter Vitha addressed the fleet broadcast personally. Her image appeared across every command bridge in the Armada. She spoke of unity, of necessity, of correcting a dangerous deviation in the conclave system. But there was something different in her voice now. Not certainty. Pressure. Because she knew what had happened last time. And she knew what might happen again. Still, she proceeded. Because stopping was politically impossible. And in collapsing systems, momentum becomes governance. At the edge of the outer veil, Admiral Jonas Reth observed the incoming formation. Sarah Voss stood beside him. "They learned nothing," she said quietly. Reth did not respond immediately. "They learned something," he said finally. "They just learned the wrong lesson." A pause. "They think numbers mattered last time." Sarah looked at him. "And did they?" Retha's expression did not change. "No." That was the truth neither side could ignore. On paper, the conclave armada still outnumbered the human fleet nearly 4-1. But numbers had already stopped being the deciding factor in the previous engagement. Because the previous engagement had not been about destruction. It had been about control. And control scales differently than firepower. The armada crossed into the outer veil boundary. This time, there was no hesitation. No probing phase. No attempt at diplomacy. The conclave had already decided what this moment meant. And when systems decide meaning before contact, conflict becomes pre-written. Human electronic warfare systems activated instantly. Not as a surprise. As confirmation. Across the armada, communication channels collapsed again. But this time, the conclave had prepared partial redundancy layers. It did not help. Because the human interference was not simply jamming. It was structural disruption of coordination logic. Fleet groups fractured into semi-independent clusters within minutes. Command hierarchies degraded into parallel decision chains. Translation latency increased between species-specific command systems until synchronized action became mathematically impossible. The armada did not break. It dissolved into unsynchronized intent. And unsynchronized intent cannot win coordinated engagements. Then the human ships moved. Not as a mass. As distributed precision units. 4 and 5 ship groups entered the fragmented formation at points of maximum disorganization, not resistance. They did not target destruction. They targeted function. Engines. Weapons systems. Navigation cores. Fleet synchronization nodes. Systems that allowed ships to act as part of something larger. On the Thari flagship, alarms escalated beyond meaningful classification. Damage reports flooded in, but the reports were no longer useful. Because usefulness depends on response capability. And response capability was being selectively removed. The fleet commander shouted orders into dead channels. Across the tactical display, ships flickered into disabled states faster than the system could update. Captain Darrow Vell, observing again from the rear analysis vessel, spoke quietly. It's the same pattern, he said. His first officer asked, Same as before? Vel shook his head slightly. No. A pause. More refined. The engagement lasted 4 hours. By the end, more than 200 ships had been disabled or forced into retreat. No confirmed fatalities. Not one. Every disabled vessel retained life support. Every crew survived. On the human flagship, Admiral Reth opened a broadcast channel to the remaining active Conclave command cluster. The Thari fleet commander appeared. He looked different this time. Not defiant. Not composed. Calculating in real time what had gone wrong twice. Reth spoke simply. You came back with the same plan. A pause. It didn't work the first time. Another pause. And it won't work again. Silence. Then Reth delivered the line that would circulate through every Conclave network within hours. We didn't kill your ships. We could have. Go home. And understand why we didn't. The channel closed. And in that closing, something more permanent than a battle result settled across the Conclave. Because for the first time, they were no longer dealing with an unknown force. They were dealing with a known restraint. And restraint, when proven, becomes more terrifying than aggression. The return of the Armada did not feel like victory for anyone who survived it. It felt like exposure. 340 warships had left Conclave space with authority, certainty, and the assumption of overwhelming control. They returned in fragments. Not destroyed. Not annihilated. But stripped of function, cohesion, and confidence. And that difference changed everything. On Conclave Station, the atmosphere in the Chamber of 12 had shifted so completely that even the architecture seemed less imposing. Delegates no longer spoke over each other with certainty. They spoke with caution, as if every word might be corrected by reality itself. High Arbiter Vitha addressed the Council in a closed emergency session. Her voice carried the weight of someone attempting to preserve structure that no longer responded to command. The official narrative was still intact. The expedition had been a corrective success in intent, but disrupted in execution due to unforeseen variables. But no one in the room believed in narratives anymore. They believed in results. And the result was simple. Humanity could not be forced back. Not militarily. Not economically. Not politically. Because every attempt to do so had only demonstrated a deeper truth. Humanity was not the weakest participant in the system. They were the one component the system had been unknowingly built upon. Across Conclave space, the consequences of that realization spread faster than any fleet. Trade networks stabilized in local pockets where human-aligned systems still operated. Rift corridors continued to degrade in regions without joint maintenance. Entire sectors began to reorganize themselves around new assumptions. Not loyalty. Stability. And stability, increasingly, was being found outside the Conclave's direct control. In the Outer Veil, Bastion Velar had completed its primary expansion phase. It now functioned not as a single station, but as a networked hub of allied systems. Human engineers worked alongside Orith structural designers in synchronized cycles that required no translation delay. Delhari navigation teams mapped routes that were immediately validated by human correction algorithms. Meson communication arrays stabilized deep space coordination between species that had never before shared operational protocols. It was not unity in ideology. It was unity in function. On the observation deck, Sarah Voss stood with Admiral Jonas Reth. Neither of them was watching the Conclave anymore. They were watching what was being built beyond it. Reth spoke first. They've stopped calling it a punishment, he said. Sarah replied without turning. What do they call it now? An alternative, he said. A pause. And a warning. Sarah finally looked toward the distant expanse of stars. Warnings were always more effective than declarations. Because declarations demanded belief. Warnings demanded recognition. Behind them, Venri of the Orith Collective joined the observation silently. Its presence had become common in human command spaces, not as subordination, but as collaboration. The Conclave is fragmenting further, Venri stated. Yes, Sarah said. And it will continue, Venri added. Reth nodded once. Until it either adapts, he said, or becomes irrelevant. No one disagreed, because disagreement required an alternative outcome, and there were fewer and fewer of those left. Far away, in conclave space, High Arbiter Vitha remained in office. But her authority no longer extended across a unified system. It extended across what remained of a shrinking coalition of species trying to maintain coherence in a structure that no longer behaved as one entity. Her final internal report described humanity not as an adversary, but as a systemic correction point, a term that carried no emotional weight, only structural meaning. The irony was not lost on those few who still read it carefully. Humanity had once been treated as a minor participant, then as a dependency, then as a threat, and now, finally, as something closer to a fundamental constraint on the system itself. In the outer veil, a new convoy departed Bastion Velar. Human ships and allied vessels moved together in formation toward unmapped regions beyond the last surveyed boundary. Not fleeing, not conquering, expanding. Reth watched them go. "Do you think they'll come again?" he asked quietly. Sarah considered the question. "They already did," she said. A pause. "And they already learned what happens when they do it wrong." Venri tilted its head slightly. "And if they come again correctly?" Sarah allowed a faint expression that was not quite a smile. "Then we won't be the same either." The convoy disappeared into the dark between systems, not as a declaration of dominance, not as an act of rebellion, but as something far more permanent. A civilization no longer asking permission to exist in the structure it had been holding together all along.